The Iran war that began on February 28th with Operation Epic Fury appears to be winding down, at least for right now. Maybe, who the hell knows, but at least things have been relatively quiet for a while. Regardless, the campaign has gone on long enough that we can start looking at what the US military learned or might want to think about learning before another fight breaks out. So today we are going to do a bit of an after-action assessment and discuss aircraft carriers, interceptors, and soft US bases, and I don't know, I might even go on a little bit of a tangent there at the end. With everything that follows, we have to keep in mind that Iran is not considered a peer military. The navy that they had before the war mostly showed up pre-Islamic Revolution, so before 1979. The Air Force was the same, with F-4 Phantoms, F-5s, and F-14 Tomcats, but also MiG-29s and Mirage F-1s that they got from Iraq in 1991. But Iran had, and still has to some extent, a large missile force, drones, coastal defenses, mines, air defenses, underground facilities, and the ability to threaten US forces and shipping across an entire region. This is what makes the Iran war useful as a stress test. The truth is, there aren't many, if any, peers to the US military. We are more likely to engage in limited and partially ruinous warfare, as Aldous Huxley seems to have predicted in the 1946 foreword to Brave New World. That being said, Iran still proved a pretty formidable foe. Not that they necessarily stood toe-to-toe and duked it out with the US military, but they bobbed and weaved enough to tire out the heavyweight and get some shots in themselves. So as we go forward, keep in mind that these lessons that we're learning might be learned a lot harder if we are to fight something that resembles more of a peer military. Alright, that's enough of that. The first lesson that we're going to start with is that aircraft carriers are still really important, despite the arguments that drones and anti-ship missiles are making them obsolete. During Operation Epic Fury, they gave the US a way to move air power without relying entirely on land bases. That is really important in places like the Middle East, where access to bases is political and defending them can be really difficult, and host nations may not want to be seen as launch pads for every part of an American war. Several countries even placed limits on what the US could do from airfields contained within their borders. Spain just straight up forbade any use of its air bases or airspace to launch attacks on Iran. Italy stopped US planes from landing at Sigonella before going to the Middle East, allegedly only because the Pentagon did not get prior authorization from Rome, and that's mostly been fixed now. Turkey, which borders Iran, also put some restrictions on US forces using Incirlik. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait both reportedly placed restrictions after Project Freedom, which was the US effort to open the Strait of Hormuz back up, fearing reprisals from Iran. Even though they later lifted those restrictions, it is a great example of how difficult it is to project power half a world away. Aircraft carriers parked in international waters with direct access, meaning we don't need to get airspace permissions, to whatever country we are attacking, is the simplest way around these restrictions. You can just park a carrier strike group, which can have as many as 48 strike aircraft and lots of other supporting assets, out in international waters, and nobody can tell you not to. And that can be pretty useful, because just during Epic Fury, which ran from February 28th to the ceasefire on April 8th, US forces flew more than 10,000 missions, hitting over 13,000 targets. Now, a chunk of those targets were hit by land or sea-based missiles like the ATACMS that were used to take out some Iranian boats, and a reminder, those are fired from HIMARS and, of course, Tomahawks, but the story from Epic Fury really does revolve around air power. Between USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford carrier air wings, F-35s, F-18s, A-18G Growlers, E-2Ds, MH-60s, and more were used extensively to hit Iran, and just as important, to patrol the skies after. Don't worry, USS George H.W. Bush carrier fans, we didn't forget about you. It's just that the Bush showed up after the ceasefire went into effect. Geographically, Iran is all but surrounded by US bases between Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, and the UAE. the US wasn't really hurting for places to land and take off. But we still rush carriers to the region because they give options and an incredible amount of firepower in a well-protected package. That might get some people a little riled up because everybody seems to think that drones and anti-ship missiles are making carriers obsolete. But carriers also come with destroyers, submarines, frigates, and other support vessels that keep them safe. They can also move whenever they want, and that makes them pretty hard to find in a very large ocean. Believe it or not, land-based installations also require protection, and they can be harder to protect sometimes than carriers because they cannot move, and they're a little easier to observe from the ground from, say, I don't know, militia members in Iraq who are sympathetic to Iran. So if carriers aren't the most impactful weapon in the US arsenal, they gotta be damn close. But to be fair, carriers are not a super weapon and they don't solve every problem. They need lots of support. They take an incredible amount of manpower to keep running, and they're just really expensive. But right now and for the foreseeable future, they create far more problems for the enemy than they do for us. So until that changes, they are going to stay essential. But as missiles and drones get cheaper, more accurate, and can reach farther, that equation might flip, which brings us to our next lesson: defenses and interceptors. This isn't a secret. The US has a bad but necessary habit of shooting down cheap drones and missiles with $4 million PAC-3 interceptors and other exquisite yet expensive weapons. The other side of that bad habit is that those expensive interceptors usually come out of equally expensive systems, like the Patriot and even THAAD. And as is the case with many expensive things, we don't make a lot of them and they take a while to build. So the lesson from the Iran war is that we need more of everything for air defense, more of those expensive interceptors and systems, but also a lot of cheaper ways to shoot down those Shahed drones, and we should really probably start to worry about small counter-UAS for FPV and other Group 1 and 2 drones a little more too. Through 66 days of Operation Epic Fury, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, estimates that we fired upwards of 1,430 Patriot interceptors, 370 SM-6s, 250 SM-3s, and 290 THAAD interceptors. Now, those are the numbers on the very high end of their best guess, but even half of those is a significant amount potentially worth years of production. I'm not saying that the Pentagon isn't working to fix this now. As we talked about in another video, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin recently signed 7-year agreements to ramp up production of everything from Tomahawk cruise missiles to THAAD interceptors. Leaders have also purchased many lower-end solutions to knock down drones and other threats. These include the Coyote, which we've also talked about in another video, APKWS-2 rockets, MIROPS, and other cheaper systems with cheaper ways to kill things. To further lower the cost per kill, things like high-energy laser weapons, microwave weapons, and electronic warfare systems are being developed and fielded more rapidly. The Air Force has put the Thor microwave weapon through some tests, and according to Jared Keller at Laser Wars, the US military has at least 16 laser weapons that are operational right now. But even lasers and energy weapons have some pretty severe shortfalls. They usually need a ton of power, they don't necessarily work great in poor weather, and they require line of sight, and those are just to name a few of their shortfalls. But they'd be working in a layered defense because not everything can do everything, and that's okay. We also have to keep in mind that these million-dollar missiles we all like to poke fun at are usually defending multi-million or even billion-dollar systems. And the service members and civilians being protected by these pricey projectiles are worth quite a bit on their own too. So we really can't reduce this to a purely numbers argument. But every dollar spent to take out a $50,000 Shahed drone is a dollar that cannot be spent somewhere else, like on search and rescue helicopters, which we are a bit short on, or E-7 Wedgetails that the Pentagon now says that we need. The real problem here is that we are kind of late to getting around to this, kind of like how we didn't see, or at least didn't respond to the IED threat in Iraq fast enough and got caught with thin-skinned Humvees. And that's a big deal will, because this will take some time to get right, even with lower end systems and production ramp agreements with big defense primes. As we catch up, the enemy will evolve, and this cat and mouse game will continue for eternity, or until the machines take over, or the aliens that definitely aren't just balloons being shot down by F-16s and F-22s finally conquer us. Plus, no matter how good these defensive measures are, drones and missiles and whatever else is being lobbed at us will still slip through. That is just inevitable, and to expect otherwise is unrealistic and ignorant of reality. So with that in mind, the final lesson we are going to talk about is hardened shelters, bunkers, and making US bases across the globe a little more resilient to enemy attacks. During the global war on terror, we didn't have to look up much. The Taliban did not have an air force, and neither did Iraqi insurgents until about Mosul in 2017, when small drones started showing up in a noticeable way. Besides indirect fire from mortars, rockets, and things like that, not much was getting over the wire. Most of the threats were at the ground level, and our footprint across the entire region reflected and still reflects that. Sure, we had IDF bunkers made out of sandbags, HESCO, or T-walls, but a lot of business was done out of shipping containers. Most service members slept in tents, ramshackle huts, or if they were lucky, those same shipping containers. Now we seem to be paying the price of becoming complacent. This is an unfortunate fact that became abundantly apparent when 6 US soldiers were killed and more than 20 were injured in a tactical operations center in Kuwait after an Iranian drone struck the building they were in on March 1st. Investigative reporting following the incident, including soldiers who were there going on record, alleges that the Pentagon was woefully unprepared for this, and that troops were basically left in an unfortified spot that was a known Iranian target. The Pentagon pushed back on these assertions immediately and continues to push back, but on March 23rd they asked for rapidly fieldable bunkers and other hardened structures for the CENTCOM AO. So leaders seem to realize that we need some beefier buildings, despite saying everything was fine. You may be listening to this and thinking, yeah, this isn't new. And you're absolutely right. Our friends at the War Zone and lots of other people have been beating the drum about the need for hardened facilities at major US installations for years. This cry for fortifications grew louder just a year ago when we witnessed Ukraine attack numerous Russian aircraft deep inside Russia as they sat on the tarmac in Operation Spiderweb. There are also many calling for the US to go underground, like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and many others are doing. We have to assume right now today that if it is above ground, we are being watched by drones, satellites, balloons, or spy planes. The only way to really avoid that is to go beneath the surface. As we've seen with Iran, tunneling down can be pretty effective. Despite undergoing a significant bombing campaign for over 2 months, including many underground bunkers being hit, Iran's stockpile of munitions and launchers is still pretty robust, at least according to the US intelligence community, which estimates that 70% of launchers and 70% of ballistic missiles remain in the game. Close observers of Russia's 3-day special military operation in Ukraine will notice that 4 years after the invasion, the front lines are mostly underground as well. As we said earlier, we have to assume that if it is out in the open, something is watching it, and then something will shortly try to kill it. When you see the fighting in Ukraine, you get this feeling that FOBs and COPs are outdated ideas, and running mounted patrols might not work out that well. Then you start to realize that the entire game plan set up during GWOT has been lapped by the proliferation of cheap long-range ballistic missiles, drones, and constant observation. Military leaders do seem to realize this, with Marine Major General Francis Donovan, the commander of SOUTHCOM, saying, "We could be much better with our own kind of discipline in how we set ourselves, move into a location, work with partners, and reduce our digital footprint." To put that into context, he was talking about how the era of the large base in a combat zone may be over, and we will have to adjust everything that hinged on that, like logistics, support, and medical care. So those are the 3 big lessons, but now I'm going to throw in my own lesson here, and that is that the US military is really damn good at what they do. Regardless of the politics of everything, our service members on the bleeding edge of our foreign policy do incredible things. Flying over 10,000 missions and hitting over 13,000 targets in just 2 months is incredible. Swatting hundreds of threats out of the sky across an immense area of operations is not easy. Objectively speaking, and that means not getting emotional about it, our troops are doing everything they are being told, and they are doing it really, really well. Just like in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other recent conflicts, militarily speaking, we have no match. Politically speaking is another thing, and we're not going to get into it here, but this is just for me to editorialize a little bit and say that I'm proud of, and all of us here at Task and Purpose are proud of, the men and women who represent us all in uniform. And we think it's important to make that really clear, because this is not a takedown of things that the service members aren't doing well. They're doing everything that's being asked of them, and they're doing it really well. And they're doing it even though there's not a whole lot of information about what they're doing and why. So, US military, pretty powerful. No matter what you have to say, no one's going toe to toe. It just isn't in the cards for anybody else. But anyway, let's move on. To wrap it up, there are several other lessons that can be learned from Operation Epic Fury. Like, range is really important. We probably need more ships in the Navy. We probably need to be able to reload VLS cells at sea. Air supremacy is just really damn hard. And contested choke point waterways are a tough nut to crack. But these three, carriers, interceptors, and making bases harder targets, are, at least in our opinion, the biggest lessons that we absolutely need to learn now. If you have any that we missed, tell me how stupid I am in the comments and let us know about it. I promise that you will not hurt my feelings, because I don't have those left. Even if I did, you guys wouldn't be able to hurt my feelings, because I'll just ignore it and pretend like everything is okay, like I do with most other things in my life. So take your best shot. You're gonna miss, but it might be fun, so have at it in the comments. Alright, now it's channel update time, and I wrote this script and Savvy edited the video. Some things to look forward to from old Task and Purpose on YouTube. We're gonna have a video come out real soon on the Harrier. I was there earlier today for the Harrier sundown ceremony on Cherry Point. It was sad. Lots of people getting a little emotional. It's kind of funny seeing grown men get emotionally attached to a plane, but I get it. But we'll have a video coming out on that. We're going to be going to a lot more things and doing stuff like that, so stay tuned. If I made a mistake, and it's a big mistake, not like I said a word wrong or said the wrong word in a spot, go ahead and send me an email at kyle.gunn@taskandpurpose.com with corrections in the subject line. That way I can issue a correction on the next video that we record. And it's kind of fun to see what people pay attention to. I've gotten a few small ones, and that's cool. I don't care. But like, I'm going to mispronounce words. You can just bet on it, right? But don't, because that's probably not a good idea, because I'll game it and do some insider trading and make some money off of it. But anyways, let's see. We have a store. Store.taskandpurpose.com. You can use code ACTUALLYWATCH to get 10% off this and many other fine examples of merchandise, like that sharp little hat there. And that's all I got. I'm going to shut up and go away. It's been a long day. I know that doesn't mean anything to you guys out in the audience, because it's you have no concept of what my day's like, because it's just a video. But anyway, time to shut up now. I'm Kyle, your friendly ginger producer man. You are all dismissed. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and I will see you next time.